As people sort of join us, and it'll take a little bit for everybody to get in here, but it is 7:00, and we're going to get rolling here in just a second. But I wanted to go ahead and open it up for people to join us and watch the participation number grow here at the bottom. But thank you all for joining us. This is the kickoff of the 2021 Wilderness Speaker Series that we do in partnership with the Montana Wilderness Association's Flathead Kootenai chapter, the Northwest Montana Lookout Association, and of course, the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation. Normally, on the first Wednesday of February, March, and April, we would be gathering in the halls of the Flathead Valley Community College. But one of the silver linings, I will say, of the pandemic is the ability to convert to these virtual formats, which allows a broader community to join in on these important discussions and hear from important voices like Dr. Lanham's that we're going to hear tonight. But we're thrilled to have all of you here with us tonight. We have quite a number of you here. As you are joining us tonight, there is a Q&A box for you to ask questions that I will try to get to as many of them as we can. We do have about 320 people registered for tonight, so there'll be, I'm sure, a lot of questions. And if we don't get to yours, I'm going to try to get to them as many as we can. Tonight, I sit in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation offices here in Hungry Horse, Montana. It's where we start our work across the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. We live and work on the ancestral lands of the Salish, Kootenai, and Blackfeet people. And that recognition is an important part of our work, an important part of our discussion tonight. Tonight, we talk about inclusion as a criterion for the future of conservation and wilderness with Dr. Drew Lanham. Drew is an alumni distinguished professor and master teacher of wildlife ecology at Clemson. He is a cultural and conservation ornithologist whose work addresses a confluence of race, place, and nature. He is a birder and a hunter. He's an author, someone I'm honored to have called a friend for quite a number of years now. I see that Drew is joining us from the thicket. Drew, thanks for joining us tonight.
It's good to be here, Bill. Thanks for having me out there or here. You know, we're meeting somewhere in the air between Big Sky and the Palmetto State. The dark corner is where I am.
The dark corner of the Palmetto State. That's right.
Yeah.
I've always had a connection to you. We're roughly the same age, and we probably grew up 80 miles apart. You in Northwest South Carolina, and me in Western North Carolina, and it's exciting to finally have this conversation that we've kind of been having off and on over the last few years, and to be able to have it in a way that people can join us. I want to share with people something real quick, and then ask you to share with some folks. But one of the things that's always drawn me, Drew, to your perspectives on this important conversation, I'll begin with a quote that you share. So Drew has a fantastic book called The Home Place, right here, Memoirs of a Colored Man's Love Affair with Nature. And you kick off literally the introduction to yourself for this book with a quote from Frederick Douglass that reads, I prefer to be true to myself, even at the hazard of incurring the ridicule of others, rather than to be false and incur my own abhorrence. It spoke to me, that quote, when I read your book a number of years ago, of something that's so true about you is your ability to speak to your true heart. Not concerned about toes you may step on, but also not intentionally stepping on those toes, but always being true to yourself. And in that introduction, you write, and I'm going to be sort of paraphrasing a little bit here, but I am a man in love with nature. I am an eco-addict, consuming everything that the outdoors offers in its all-you-can-sense seasonal buffet. I am a wildling born of forests and fields, and more comfortable on unpaved back roads and winding woodland paths than in any other place with concrete, asphalt, and crowds. And later in that section, you go on to say, I am a scientist, I'm as much a scientist as I am a Black man. My skin defines me no more than my heart does, but somehow my color often casts my love affair with nature in shadow. Being who and what I am doesn't fit the common calculus. I am the rare bird, the oddity, appreciated by some for my different perspective and discounted by others as an unnecessary nuisance among an unusually colored fish, as an unusually colored fish out of water. Just a fantastic opening to a fantastic book. And I appreciate you giving me the liberty to sort of condense a little bit of that opening chapter. But I think as an introduction to you, I'd love for you to share a poem that you had written a couple of years ago to share with the wilderness group that I'd love for this group to hear from you, but as we get into this conversation.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, it's interesting that we grew up so close, and now you're all the way across the country, man. But
Yeah.
it gives me an excuse to another reason to come out there and commune with you. So I look forward to past this, and also wanted to make just a little bit of space for um, our current predicament, and for those hundreds of thousands who've lost their lives, for those millions who are ill. Um, just leaving that space there for us to understand where we are in all of this, and to be honest, to have the privilege to reach across all these miles to talk to you about something that's important for both of us, and I think is at the soul of some of our healing, hopefully, eventually, in this nation. So I call this Reconsidering Wildness, and I wrote it for a conference that I never got to, but I've thought a lot about it. So I'm going to read this, and I'll preface it by saying a little bit of the language may occasionally get into a little bit of a chasm, but I hope those out there listening, there is never any offense intended. Reconsidering Wildness. Just wondering, who gets grandfathered in for indigenous? Who counts as bearing straight, land bridgeable, or green carded in by wind sailing ship, or broad-shouldered rowboat, or wall-weary desert dusty feet? Who gets to be great again original? If Ellis Island and the big-assed Copper Lady didn't welcome in your long-ago Euro kin, can the descendants of a chattel people bought and sold and raped and whipped and killed make peace with the trees from whence his or her or their ancestors once hanged? If a bird-watching Negro is lynched in a national forest, does anyone really care? Does wilderness mean all the white people pack up and leave? Can I get my 40 acres and a mule back before the big hike? Please. Okay, when? Do all the dams come tumbling down? Can we drain lakes with man-made names, close the made-up to sound wild exclusive neighborhood gates? Does wild get colorfully redefined? Can we ungerrymander the bias between the GIS lines? Is the WILDNESS with the added E and the R nestled by policy and nurtured by perception between the D and the N just for the ones who can afford to escape to it on the long weekend? Is it just for those born to the privilege of high-end recreational disposable time and income to leave it, and maybe the rest of us darker-hued, less prone to being wildable, all behind? Just wondering all this as I lace up my waterproof lug-soled truth-teller boots. It's a new brand, you see. I got them on clearance from NGW, Negroes Gone Wild. Wondering if the knobby-kneed cypress that grew bald-branched in winter and older by centuries than Methuselah before he was ever born might resprout from sulfur-stank pluff mud to be the place primeval where parakeets and Lord God birds resurrect and return. Will the souls of runaway, self-liberated, once enslaved maroons be able to lift their eyes to free skies as billions of pigeons, passengering by, live on beyond the one named Martha in a zoo cage and extinction forever gone prison bars? Do millions of acres of wheat and oats and corn and soy on dark Chernosem soil become old-growth tall grass without Latin names again? Do all the Angus and Hereford beeves get spun up into the eco-rapture, leaving their hooves and hides on hallowed prairie ground for the ferruginous hawks and black-footed ferrets and the coyote to claim, and grizzly and bison and pronghorn and elk to return and do the same? By the way, the ghost of Ed Abbey came to me in the midst of a monkey-wrenching dream and recommended a strong nasal decongestant for Mount Rushmore. A booger bomb would do wonders, he claimed. It would clear the great again white fathers' heads of notions that they created all of this by divine manifest, and it was by cosmic evolved design, already sacred ground. The ghost dancers at Sitting Bull's council and the haunting screams from Wounded Knee approve the booger blasting move and will gladly reclaim their sacred Black Hills. Just wondering in all of this, where does wilderness fit in? So I'm thinking, Bob, that we are all just salmon. The best we can hope for beyond hatching and fryling and smolting is finding home stream again, swimming hard against the seagoing currents from whence we came, making love in stony, cool-pooled orgy, and then dying. Will then live on for an eternity, having loved and spawned and melted in a wriggling homecoming orgasm, all snaggle-tooth mouth, flesh rotted to sweet stinking and tearing off. Our destiny then, as gluttonous, fat-craving black bears and musty shroom-blooming plops of brown bear shit and fairy-hiding ostrich ferns and feather-submersible water ouzels and downy mist-sodden marble murrelet younglings at the tops of heaven-raking Doug firs that suck in the air blown out in orcapod snot salty spray, bloody with the taste of unfortunate sea lion pups whose morning milk-full mothers could not do enough to save them from bad luck or evolution. And then the trees and every green thing making life from the sun exhales, and we breathe, but don't take breathing for granted, ask George Floyd. And the big silver chinook that we are now lying egg and sperm empty as nutrient nurturing for forests to come and dying to be wildness eternal was lucky and quick to come home one last time and be this, dead to live on, wild forever. Wild without the E, wild without the R. Is that enough to hold on to who we are? Or do we require more to make things better, wilder? My answer would be a categorically emphatic and cautiously conditioned, let's peel back all these complex layers and say yes, then an unequivocal hell no. Let's have it all together, every single letter we can hunt and gather, because this land is your land and it happens to be my land too, but it was theirs before either of us intruded. First Nations, but then the wolf and eagle and puma and other wild folk would make first claim. Let's share in all this wealth before it's sold to some rich SOB with enough privilege to not care. So spell it with me now, W-I-L-D. That's where we will begin this negotiation of ethic. Add in an E for everyone and then an R for relevance. The N-E-S-S will be the suffix we attach when the wild folk give us their wing-hooved, horn-scaled, slithering fin, swimming blessings of entry. Only then will we have any right to the word or any spelling complete enough to claim such a holy term.
Wow. Wow. I didn't need to do the introduction with the Frederick Douglass quote because I think it's very clear to everybody what an incredibly true to your heart way you have to speak to the topic that we're here to talk about tonight. So thanks for sharing that, Drew. What a great story. I think a lot about the wilderness idea, seen through the lens of 2020 and now 2021, as something that we need to no longer just look backwards with for those folks that we've put on a pedestal before, or looking backwards with the blindness to the fact that what we now call public lands are also referred to as stolen lands, the lands that belong to those First Nations people. What in your mind, how do we go about wrestling with the past so that we can actually start to think about a future that is inclusive of all of us?
Wow. Bill, I think, I think the first thing is sort of this hands up, open hands attitude, and that open-handedness, palms up, signifies that we're coming without agenda, right? But to deal with that past, to not have sort of superficially bandaged it over while the wound's still festering. That first, in order, and I think it's a common metaphor, in order for a wound to heal, it has to be debrided, it has to be cleaned out, which is often very painful. So that truth has to be told, whether it's the truth of stolen lands out west, and the rediscovery so that they could then be called wilderness, right?
Right.
Or rice marsh on pluff mud here that was once cypress swamp that was deforested by African enslaved and then turned into land that made some of the richest people in the world for rice. But you have to tell those stories first. And in telling those stories, as painful as they may be, then you you're not coming like this and hiding, trying to hide what happened to say, oh, let's have this now. Because in doing that, it becomes this sort of game of, did you ask the right question? And so you lay it all out there on the table, first and foremost, and then I think you imagine, put in your head, sort of imagine all the people that made the decisions before, replace one or two or three or however many of those people with somebody different. Let's say you replace them with women. Let's say you replace a person with an indigenous person. What would that conversation have been like? So that's the first place, to start in the past and to acknowledge it and to have all of that out there. And that doesn't mean necessarily, yeah, some monuments have to come the hell down. I don't think the Confederate monuments don't belong up, right? But for those monuments that remain up, people need to understand who these people were. So you inform rather than erase. I think that's important. Then you come forward to the present and you look at who we are as a conservation community. And I mean, from how we educate, how we hire, what the agendas are, into NGOs and who they are. That's something that I call corporate conservation needs to be called to task. And that if corporate conservation is called to task, and then I think things can begin to broaden. But until we move out of this sort of log jam of paradigm that, let's be honest, it's built on white patriarchy. And that patriarchy of privileged men who had disposable income, disposable time to say, yeah, this is what should be wild. I can get in, but I'm going to sort of shut the door behind me. I think that we have to look at that. Not necessarily, some of this was obviously conscious and how people thought about doing these things. When you move people off of land, so then you can occupy it. So, we know that story there in your part of the world. And I always point people to places here that we know about and some that we don't. Places like Harris Neck National Wildlife Refuge, where Black communities were moved. Central Park, okay, where Christian Cooper was assaulted. Well, before Christian was assaulted, Black people were moved off of land to have some space so that you could create wildness there. So all of that has to come up. Otherwise, you continue to build lie upon lie. And it's sort of like a beaver dam, right? Beaver are constantly repairing and adding to that base, and the water stays dammed up behind it. All of that land, all of that water never truly clears until that dam is disrupted. So there is a truth dam that's there. It's a dam of lies and myth and perception. We've seen that reckoning with Muir and Leopold and Audubon, and we're going to see it with more. And I think it's important for that to come out. It's not any kind of cancel culture. What it is it's informing it.
Yeah.
So, that's where I kind of am, man. And it is. I don't think you don't look for perfect in anybody, but you look for decency. And as you and I have talked, and many others I'm sure have said, you lionizing human beings, I mean, that's a dicey proposition. So, but I think the future means that having people at the table, not one, not two, not counting some sort of token in and saying, okay, here we are. solve all the problems of BIPOC people, you person sitting at this table.
Right. Right.
And it's going to take some discomfort, man. It's going to take people wincing. It's going to take people sometimes being offended. It's going to take sometimes leaving organizations that you no longer agree with, and speaking your truth. And when that happens, I think we begin to peel away some of this. We begin to open the wound is open. It begins to be cleaned out. And then wounds don't heal well from the top down. They heal from that inside out. And evidence of healing will be in leadership changes. It'll be in that leadership change, not only looking different, but speaking different. If we look at, I'm so excited about Secretary Holland and the Interior, right?
Yeah. Big.
What's that?
Yep.
I mean, my gosh.
Seismic shift.
Yes. I mean, and so I was talking to my students, my Enviro Lit students today about this, and I dropped back and, we're talking about transcendentalism and Emerson and Thoreau and Whitman and who these people were, Fuller, as the sort of the woman that's recognized there, the non-male that's recognized there. But then I said, one of the students was reading, and she brought up a piece from Terry Tempest Williams, and she was talking about her perceptions, and I said, so much of conservation has been built on sort of a toxic male model, and that toxic masculinity lends itself to all kinds of things, like racism, like misogyny, like like genocide, or just sort of brushing past it so you can go to where you want to go because you're not affected. So all of those things, I say all that to say that there's a reckoning coming, that we have to have conversations like we're having, Bill, or else, I think we're going to lose ground. And I'm not saying you throw away everything. I don't want oil fields, all over the places that we've kind of agreed on that should be wild. But then we have to consider, I was thinking about the pandemic, and I know, these issues have been discussed, but, somebody who goes out and they want a perfect skyline of, I don't know, let's say somewhere in Arizona, and the sun is setting perfectly, and they've got a iPhone 12 full of sunset. If it just wasn't for that damn cell tower that those people gotta have.
Right.
Well, what's this? Wait a minute, hold on a minute. You're gonna post this as soon as you get back in cell phone range. You're gonna post this to Instagram so everybody can ooh and ah over the places you've been, but you would deny indigenous people 5G because you don't want the skyline with a 5G tower on it. And that's a real thing, right?
Well, that reminds me of something you wrote a few years ago about a place that you love. You and I have a shared love for the Low Country, in the other side of South Carolina from where you are. And you wrote a piece about a place that you love to go bird, but there was an opportunity for that place to become, I can't remember if it was a distribution center or a series of big box stores.
Yeah.
Her desire to see it as habitat for migratory birds was in conflict with the job creation it would mean for a part of our country that is overwhelmingly a majority Black population, right? I remember that. Yeah. I don't remember the title of the piece, but I mean, there was that conflict in your heart, right?
Oh man, that's it's constant, Bill. It's because again, I've got some of the wildest places on earth on my bucket list, right? When we can pick up again and go, um, I want to be in those places, and I love being in those places and feeling like um, I'm the first person to have ever seen it, even though I know that I'm not. But then I got to step back out of my sort of ego and think about um, others, and think about those people um, living on land, have lived on land for thousands of years, but then who are systematically killed, cheated, lied to, and still being lied to, all for me to have a clear horizon in a picture.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's constant conflict, but I think, and I think there are ways to solve some of these problems, or at least to address them. But when we assume that everyone feels the same about something, we lose ground that way, and people feel left out. It reminds me here, Congaree National Monument, which is now Congaree National Park. There were really very few conversations that were had with the Black folks who live in one of the highest densities of Black land ownership in the Southeast. In Congaree, for those people who've been here in South Carolina, that's a wild place, right?
Yeah.
And but to not have had conversations with people, and I remember there was a quote from a gentleman who said, when we saw the conservationists coming, I won't use the name of the organization, he said, it was just like the Klan coming.
Wow.
So if we're not careful, if we don't go palms up and say this is what's been happening, then I think there will be more of that. So, I mean, you moved from a wild corner of North Carolina to an even wilder place there. Is there a difference in how people view wildness there?
Yeah, there is, in a sense that it's more the ER part of wilderness is more ingrained in people's lives. They value living in a place, and they live in that place because there are large swaths of not just wildness but wilderness, and so whereas in the East, and my work in the East was also often informed by having to educate people about even just the public lands idea. The overwhelming majority of people that I talk to here, I don't have to explain what wilderness is. They know what matter of fact, the number one thing I've heard in my 2 years since arriving in Montana, when I say I work at the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation, is I love the Bob. I mean, people know the place, but how many people know Joyce Kilmer Slick Rock, right? Or
Yeah.
Ellicott Rock, just in your backyard right there, right? But I think about. I think we're gonna have to keep coming back to this metaphor of. I've been thinking about the metaphor as a gift we've been given, but actually, the metaphor that you gave of a beaver's dam, and that it's constantly rotting and deteriorating underneath, and so we have to constantly rebuild it. I think we'll be constantly tonight in this conversation thinking about what the new sticks are that we put on the top of that dam. And your example of Congaree, I have one from my time in North Carolina of sitting on an incredibly important panel that was going to inform forest management decisions for the Nantahala-Pisgah National Forest for the next 20 years, part of a forest management planning process. And they had selected 30 people to sit around this table for the Nantahala-Pisgah. And I looked around, and I was in my early 50s, and I was the second youngest person in the room, I think, or maybe third or fourth youngest person in the room. But I will tell you this, I was the same hue, same tone, everybody else in the room. And yet from Linville Gorge Wilderness, you could throw a rock and hit Charlotte, a community that has a large African-American population, or Greenville, South Carolina from Ellicott Rock, right? And decisions were being formed, and there was not a person of color to be seen in that room. And I brought it up multiple times when people had to fall off that group and were talking about replacing bodies. I kept saying time out. And yet I kept running into this resistance of the easy. The easy was to just plug in another conservation organization person who didn't represent these communities, who loved and shared these places. You know, the Hispanic community around Western North Carolina loved Wilson Creek as an example, and there was no voice there. And, you know, your example of the Congaree is another one of those. And how do we think about how we constantly rebuild that beaver dam in ways that everybody's at the table? Is the practical sometimes runs headlong into the aspirational, right?
Yeah.
What do we do to find those sticks, right?
Because it's not just one beaver that brings the sticks to the dam.
Right.
You know, yeah, I'm constantly intrigued by it because, you know, in talking to students about how they see it, and how much difference that E and that R makes, you know, it's I call it scales of ecology, but also scales of sociology, and there's a privilege to having these places, for some of us, but then for those who can never get there. You know, I think about how things are marketed and who gets to go to these places, and you know, you got to wear, maybe you wear a certain label, you drive a certain kind of car, or that's how you get there. And then, you know, this conversation I'm having with a journalist yesterday about leave no trace, I'm like, well, so what does that mean, right? Leave no trace. And that idea of going and being there, and not understanding. So you leave no trace, but then you look at the petroglyph of the trace that was left, and understand that you weren't here first, that all of the decisions aren't yours to make. So I think, Bill, from a point of view of the dam metaphor, that it's shared work. You know, that in this lodge that we have, there are several beavers, and that those beavers, when they hear water running, you know, somebody's going out there at that dam, and I haven't looked. I'm not I'm not a beaver specialist, but I'm willing to bet you that at some point somebody's good at packing mud at the bottom sometimes, and somebody's good at going and getting aspen, because they like aspen bark, you know,
Right.
and so they're just going to bring. But then somebody else brings birch. You know, somebody else out there, you know, for some reason they like ironwood, but all of those sticks go into that dam. But you know, it's important, I think, for us to recognize that sometimes, you got to sit back. And one of the first things on these committees and board tables that we talk about, or that I think about, is listening. You know, I think about my colleague Karen Hall, who's now out in Washington State, but she worked with the Cherokee nation here. And Karen I would see her sometimes when she was working on her dissertation, and she would come back, and she would tell me that how many years she had to wait to get the opportunity to listen.
Wow.
And you know, and so if we're operating, and I understand, if we're operating on a, you know, 2 or 4 year funding cycle, after mistreating people for hundreds and hundreds of years, don't expect magic answers at one board meeting,
Or one funding cycle.
or one funding cycle. You know, you've thrown a little bit of cash at it, and you're like, oh, okay, that'll work. So you had an interesting thing going on here when you were in Western North Carolina, and you had this exchange that you would do between Atlanta and Western North Carolina and Western North.
Yeah. Yeah, and Yonkers, New York, and this goes to the one funding cycle. We did a partnership with Groundwork Hudson Valley with, these were kids from Puerto Rico, these were kids from the Caribbean, these were kids from Ghana who were living in Yonkers, New York, and who were doing some green infrastructure projects in Yonkers. But the next step in their process was to come spend a summer in wilderness, and it was transformational, and it was as or more transformational for the staff at the wilderness organization I worked with as it was for the kids that were coming from Yonkers. But guess what? We had 2 years of funding, and we watched this transformation go on. And it has had ripple effects. So don't get me wrong, it wasn't ineffectual. It absolutely had profound effects, and some of those kids have gone on to careers in the Park Service and the Forest Service and elsewhere. But the almost the institutionalized funding mechanism needs to not be, oh, we're going to let you try this for a couple of years. It needs to be, we're committed to helping you like really make this embedded in your culture. And here at the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation, it's embedded in our strategic plan. It's embedded in our budget for the years to come. And so it's, but I've watched the transformation happen, which is a personal level question, but it's also, it becomes that bedrock building the dam for the future question too, right?
Yeah.
But it also requires, folks like me who are, I live in this wilderness bubble. I work in wilderness. I live next door to wilderness. To get outside of my bubble, Dr. Carolyn Finney, who wrote Black Faces, White Spaces, talks about the work of organizations like the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation. We can't think that the solution is just inviting folks to our table. We need to go to those tables, right? And can you talk about that a little bit? Because I've been wrestling with what that looks like in our work.
Bill, let me tell you, you were talking about that program. I go back to what I think was one of the most effective programs I've ever been a part of. And that was the Together Green program that Audubon had funded for, man, it was, there was a cohort of 40 people a year that got $10,000 each to go back to their communities and do grassroots conservation. Now this was, this was back, mid 2000s, 2008, 2009, around in there. And so people were getting, it was a very competitive fellowship. I was in the first fellowship class. Judy Browse, and Umali Ferguson were amazing running that program. But I remember at our training at NCTC, that first day on the agenda, there was after lunch, there was an hour given for diversity, right? And there was a mini revolt, because there were, out of these 40 people, there were like, I don't know, 8 or 9 people of color in the room, right? And we were like, whoa, 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 an hour?
Right.
And rest her soul, Iantha Gant Wright was there, and and we ended, and Judy and Anne sort of stepped away, and we all had this conversation, and it became a much larger part and ended up becoming a portion of this program. Now, Toyota, in the first iteration of that, funded that program for $20 million.
Wow.
Second iteration of it, they funded it for 14 or 15. But it was too much about people. Some folks couldn't get out of their head that Audubon was doing something different, that Together Green, so it disappeared.
Wow.
So
it wasn't enough about birds, I guess. Is that your point? It
right,
was about people, not enough about birds.
Right, because like people were going back to communities and talking about community gardens. So that was people taking it back to their places. It wasn't an organization saying, come here, do our bidding. These were original ideas of people on the ground in neighborhoods. I know that money is still out there from some organizations.
Sure.
And I know Judy has tried to continue some of this with NAAEE, but I look at that program and I look at the success that it had and what it did in communities. There were studies that talked about how $10,000 was leveraged into hundreds of thousands of dollars of benefit, millions by now. How people's lives were changed. I'm still in touch with lots of these people. So that programmatically, what you did and we're doing with that exchange, Together Green, those kinds of things, why do those things disappear when they start working?
Right. Right.
And I think, I'll just leave that.
Now there's somebody already pulling it back to a mission that was maybe a little short-sighted in its drafting, because it was drafted at a period before we had enough of the beavers at the table to draft that. I mean, I am throwing any mission statements under the bus and saying that, but frankly, that's what happens, right? Like, well, why are you investing in people over here when our mission is over here?
Yeah.
It's because they're connected. There's that interconnectedness to all of that. There's a couple questions in the Q&A box I want to get to, and folks, if you have questions for us tonight, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you'll click in there and ask your question, don't put it in the chat box. You're welcome to put stuff in the chat box, but for questions, I want to be looking at this box, and I'll go back to, I'll answer one easy one. Ed, thanks to your question about this conversation and is it being recorded? It is, and we will be putting it on the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation website, bmwf.org, in a day or two after this. So it is being recorded, and so it will be out there for folks to pass along. But one of the questions is from Michael: would it make sense for the environmental movement to agree to a truth and reconciliation process, taking leadership in dealing with these issues?
I think that's a great idea. Let me tell it's funny. I always think about what would have happened in the past. We talk about the past. If there had been some collusion, some confluence between the environmental movement and the civil rights movement. King was beginning to talk about some of those issues, but
and there's the interesting intersection of the Wilderness Act and the Civil Rights passing in 64, right?
Right. So I think that's a great place to start. And when I think, and I'm not smart enough to think like some folks are thinking about things like a Green New Deal, but I think and I've written a bit about eco-reparation, and people don't like that word. But when we think about eco-reconciliation, when we think about having these conversations about what's important to all of us, again, we share same air, same water, same soil, same earth, same fate. So in that way, that if we can't begin to get these organizations to divest themselves of a little bit of turf and come together in some sort of, I don't know, way to say, okay, first of all, we got to break this up, and we've got to spice it up. It can't be the same old paradigm. So I think it's a good way to go. I also think it's a good way to charge organizations that are swimming in quite a bit of loose change to invest.
Yeah, and invest in the connections. There's organizations doing work for communities who for too long have been forced to live next to brownfield sites. And then there's organizations who are invested in communities who have the great privilege of living next to incredible wild spaces, right? Yeah. And we're never forced to work together. And yet there's a connection, right? And Beth Hahn asked the question: realizing there are many relevant time and spatial scales, what is your vision for truth and reconciliation, quotes around truth and reconciliation, around anti-racism and conservation?
Endless.
Yeah.
It's, that's the other thing. We can't it's not a political cycle. It's not a funding cycle. It's an evolutionary cycle. And that's not a cycle. Evolution isn't a cycle. So when I think the sooner we get out of our heads that one day we're going to be able to say, okay, it's over, because somebody tried that in, like, I don't know, 2008, and they said, oh, post-racial America. And then January 6th, or George Floyd happens, and people realize that happened. So you have, just as we don't put people on a pedestal for perfect, look at the process as ongoing. Look at it as ongoing. And Bill, you brought this up. So guess what? Visit your mission and creep out of it.
Right.
It's because some people, it's sort of like the constitutional constructionists who say, okay, all these powdered wigs wrote this, and this is exactly what it means. I want it to apply. Sure, you want it to apply because you got on a powdered wig.
Right.
But for all those people who didn't have on powdered wigs, it didn't apply. So guess what? That it's amendable and a living document. So look at the process as constant and ongoing. Don't silo it in an EDI department. EDI's got to be part of climate change, habitat conservation, and everything else. It's got to have roots and tentacles wound all throughout that. And then it's got to be constant. You can't think that you ever get to some point that you can sit back and rest. Because we're in a dynamic society. And we got to be willing to evolve and move in a way that's flexible and adaptable, that speaks to the demand.
Right. Yeah. It's a journey. It's not a destination. The journey will never end. The evolution idea is perfect. And I have been a bit of I've been in the militant camp about being careful about mission creep, but that, boy, you talk about challenging my thinking. This conversation about it's that overgroundedness in mission that keeps us from realizing that the mission wasn't formed by a full society. It was formed by, just by definition, it was formed by a limited set of people at a certain place in time. That leads into a question here from Alexa. Wilderness was created, imagined historically as places devoid of people. And this is one of the problematic phrases in the Wilderness Act of where man is a visitor and does not remain. So it was envisioned historically as places devoid of people, and that included Native peoples, even though there were Native peoples living either at the time or prior to there. How can we revisit those philosophies? And I'm one of the first people that gets scared to death about the idea of unlocking the Wilderness Act or revisiting the Wilderness Act. Scares the bejesus out of me. But it is an important thing to consider is how do we revisit those philosophies, those ideas, and even those words in the act themselves to fully represent indigenous cultures, represent people who built the wealth of this nation while not benefiting from this wealth of this nation. How do we wrestle with that idea? How do we make people like me comfortable with the idea of unlocking the Wilderness Act if that's what it takes?
First of all, ask different people what they think about it. Yeah. We haven't even gone there. So what do you think? What do you think about this? And just as I don't expect every Black person to agree with me, all indigenous people aren't going to. So I think to first have the conversation, what do you even think about it? Because the assumption has been, first of all, we say, yeah, these people made the decision. Who are the people making the decisions now? And are we talking to anyone about these decisions? So what do you think? How do you feel about this? And begin to have part of reconciliation is having some recognition first. And that recognition, as a bird watcher, that recognition comes from seeing, but most of it comes for me from hearing. So
Right.
to sit down with people and say, you know what, we just want to know what you think about this, and invest in years and years of listening. Invest in it at all scales. You know, in the smallest villages and communities to you know, to whole boroughs. How do you feel about this? How do you feel about this being built next to you? You know, I know the controversy in Kankakee, Illinois, for example, with the wildlife refuge that was being built there. And Kankakee is like heaven for Black cowboys, right? Some very rich history there, but nobody was talking to that community about this wildlife refuge.
Wow.
You know, and so when people don't even have a chance to speak up and say, you know, I don't like it, or I like it, and this is why, then they're again disenfranchised. So enfranchisement first involves recognition that there are others who need to have voice. So that reconciliation that someone brought up earlier, I think listening. I would set up, you know, first I would find the hot spots. There are so many hot spots, but I would find these hot spots and I would begin to have listening sessions. And I would use the current silver lining of what we've been doing here, where people can send in their thoughts to do that and begin to compile these things and begin to go through them and have some idea of the sentiment towards place and function and place. And then you can, but you can't have policy before you understand perception.
Right. You can't listen long enough just to say, oh, well, we'll put the word inclusive in, or we'll put the word equitable in. You have to listen long enough,
Right.
and almost back to the evolutionary idea, you have to never stop listening, right?
Yeah.
There's a question here, Dr. Lanham. I'd love to hear your thoughts about how to combat the belief that the most authentic outdoor experiences are those that involve multi-day trips into the backcountry with tons of expensive gear versus
Wow.
picnic on the edge of a particular public land unit. Changing that paradigm seems like one of the best ways to grow the movement while making it more resilient.
I so agree. You know, again, it gets to, so let's look at the scale, at least as I see it. Tame or domestic, feral, wild, wildness, wilderness. So for some folks, wild is that weed growing between the cracks of a sidewalk. It's out of bounds, so to speak, and where it people think it should be. And so part of this again is a recognition of understanding where people are and not trying to pull them where you think they should be. You know, if given the opportunity, if someone wants to be in a place, we can maybe find ways to help them get there, but ignoring space, you know, and we see a lot of this in the rural South, I think, and where people are and ignoring where they are and what they're surrounded by in rural America, and saying, well, they should be somewhere else. It would be better to be somewhere else. It's like my bird example is to, you know, is having been in you know, on the Lower East Side and hearing a peregrine, right? There's nothing wilder than a peregrine, and then seeing it pursue pigeons. So where was that? Where was that on the scale of tame, feral, wild, wildness, and wilderness? It was, I mean, that very well could have been a peregrine that had been on the North Slope. You know, so I think that this whole idea of, first of all, not losing people in the words, but giving some sort of idea of connectedness, that we don't diminish experience
Yeah,
for
which happens a
what
lot.
we do. You know, one of the privileges that I have, and it's important exercise for everybody to do this. One of the privileges that I have had in this pandemic is having a backyard, a green, safe backyard, mostly safe, I think, and that I can go into and watch birds. But everybody doesn't have that green, safe space.
Right.
So, how do we get that green, safe space into communities? And then not have someone come in and say, oh, but it's full of invasive, exotic, foreign plants. So, that's a whole nother issue that we've got to think about our lexicon. We got to think about how we speak about, and I'm an ecologist, right? So, I'm not trying to be a heretic here, but I'm saying when we talk about, because we don't talk, is it a feral horse or is it a Mustang? Or,
Right.
we're not talking about getting.
You've immediately diminished somebody's experience by saying that their wildness is not true wildness because it has,
Exactly.
invasives or.
Yeah, I dare you to go into South Dakota and say you're going to get rid of all those invasive ringneck pheasants. I dare you.
Right. Right. You're definitely challenging somebody's own perspectives on the land, right?
Yeah. Right.
I think beyond the experience question that Anders just asked us, but let's go back to the corporate conservation question, or maybe the breaking free of the corporate conservation question, because so much of the work is formed by how organizations are funded. How do we adopt the and I'm not being political here, but the Bernie Sanders model of the $10 donor versus the $10,000 donor for this work in particular?
Well, first, I think there has to be a remarketing. There has to be um, a, a remarketing of who it is, not just that you are, but that you want to be. So if you begin to show who you want to be, it was interesting to me. It's interesting to me to see a certain car company that a lot of environmentalists and conservationists drive. Name begins with an S, ends with an A. That marketers began to put black and brown people in those car commercials in outdoor spaces.
Yep.
Right.
Right.
And in my mind, I'm saying, so what made them make that decision? Well, somebody somewhere hopefully had some good in their heart to think about, we need, but then market analysis somewhere ultimately said, you know what? These people buy cars. They drive around in cars. Why can't they drive our cars? So how about organizations thinking about not just people who can give lots of money to be on a board, but people who have invaluable experience who can be on a board. Start thinking about ways to again meet people. I think about I was reading this piece, Bill, about state. It was an old 1908 report, maybe, of state Audubons, and they were talking about each state and what they had done. And in Alabama, it started off, I was like, because I'd read some bad ones that included, for South Carolina, Negroes being responsible for the decimation of birds. That's written. Wow. And so, but this one said, there is not much going on in the state, but at Tuskegee Normal, whatever, a Mr. George W. Carver asked for bird cards to distribute.
Wow.
So way before, right? 9 rules or any, here is George Washington Carver who has saved the soil of the South, but is getting the word out. And now just Dr. Rashida Fareed just reformed the George Washington Carver Bird Club at Tuskegee University.
Wow.
So I say that to say that, some conservation organization out there, back them. And Alabama Audubon it's an independent Audubon. Alabama is. They're putting their money where their mouth is in that black belt. Georgia Audubon is putting it. So where are the organizations, the big ones, where are they putting their money? Why aren't any of these organizations, and maybe they are, but why aren't there fellowships out there to help kids go to school in environmental science, conservation, and that stuff that are dedicated to BIPOC?
Right.
Where are those? Because, so that's a way to begin to expand beyond somebody who's going to give $100 or $1,000 a year. If you begin to change the culture such that people see that you're giving rather than taking, that you're coming again, not with now this time with open hands, but they've got something in them, and you're saying, you know what, we want to help. I think that there are some economically, there are some solutions for, if your state is giving tax breaks to industry, by God, so much of that would be devoted to green infrastructure and environmental sustainability in poor communities, and disadvantaged communities and communities of color.
Right.
And let's call it, it's a tax, TAX, I'll say it. But it's a way to get at some of this, and that money is there, but it just seems to somehow bypass these communities and these efforts. So yeah, I
always think about the word intentionality, right? Like we're taking intentional steps at the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation, specifically hiring our interns through a pipeline to the Greening Youth Foundation in Atlanta, specifically setting aside not just saying that we're going to advertise our opportunities, but we're only going to hire some of our positions, through a partnership to create that pipeline. And I feel like we're bouncing between the practical and pragmatic to the ethereal, but I am going to bounce to a question here real quick about, is one of the problems that we have rooted in this idea that we see man separate from nature? And that's obviously somewhat embedded in some of the language in the Wilderness Act and other legislation, but how much is this fact that it's not an inclusive space because we see man separate from nature?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the, that's what I call a moral clause, right? And so I think part of what we lost at the expense of sounding, I'm not trying to sound like any sort of fundamentalist here, but from the point of view of not having moral responsibility towards the care of nature, that we don't have an environmental bill of rights, that we have not considered ourselves as part of and not separate from, and that paradigm has been see and conquer, then save what's left. and that's sort of our model. So part of this, E.O. Wilson's been imploring it for years, right? If you remember, if you've read his letters to Baptist minister, but we're in this mode of hyper-capitalism, and we have to talk about the capitalism's role in this, right? Because there's a conquering and subduing aspect that we have to push back from, to say, okay, how can we sustainably live in the context of being a part of nature, instead of cocooning ourselves off from it and then going to it, you know, when we can afford to, or we have disposable time, that kind of thing. How do we, and my argument, Bill, is always food. You
Yeah.
know, I mean,
You
you
don't
look
have,
at me,
you don't have that
you look
shared
at me,
love
you
of
can tell.
culture comes through food, right? And
Yeah.
mm,
So when we, you know, when you look at a map of the United States and you look at the food deserts and where they are, they're abundant. It's not a unfortunately, it's not a critical habitat type in the less than way. So when we get people connected to their food, whole foods, and not expensive markets where only certain people can buy their foods, um, then they're big. I think we have a revitalization or renewal of appreciation for clean air, clean water, and clean soil. And if we can begin to get there, and you see some of this, and you see some of it, I've seen some of it with the young Black farmers groups, and stuff going on in Chicago with a group that I met with, and um, you know, the urban ecologists in Rochester, New York, at Seneca Park Zoo, and you know, former programs in the Mid-Atlantic in Maryland, um, and so, and you think about these things, and there are ways for us to get at it, but like we said before, they have to be beyond funding cycles, where just as they're becoming successful and gaining momentum, they end.
right. I had a question earlier that I want to go to that's fits in the category of personal and pragmatic and practical applications. Most of the wilderness places that we serve sit in rural America almost by definition, though there is a congressionally designated wilderness 18 miles from Times Square in New York. But by definition, wilderness sits in rural communities. How do those rural communities take tangible steps to make their community feel open and welcoming? Because to get to wilderness, you go through those communities.
Yeah, that's you know, we're and I think we're talking about what some people have or will call flyover America, or you know, in these enclaves. And I talk about range maps, and I think that one of the things that's happened in sort of our discourse is that we've been dismissive. And personally, I tell people, and yeah, I go to urban places and talk, but I'm a rural guy, right? And have those concerns. So I think part of that again is involving people in conversations. Now that's going to take a while.
Right.
That's going to take a while, because there's some entrenched stuff going on that's not pretty. I mean, if you look at Malheur Wildlife Refuge and what happened there, I'm not even going to mention the name, but we know what happened at Malheur Wildlife Refuge and who took that over. Are those people that you can have a conversation with? I don't know, but there are people who know those people who you can probably have a conversation with. And I think it's sometimes it's a brick by brick thing. Now, I'm not about beating my head out on a brick wall,
Right.
but I am about finding where there are loose bricks, or loose sticks is our dam analogy, and refitting them,
Right.
and giving them use in that dam. And then when people don't feel excluded, when they don't feel talked over or talked around, there's an opportunity to move. You know, I've got to believe, I'm still hopeful, Bill, that there are more people. There's still lots of reasonable people out there in places that we think are unreachable.
Right. And it might just be a conversation, right? That's,
It might be a conversation. It might be an open door that says, you know what, come in, here are here are the rules for discourse. We're going to be civil. We're going to respect, we're going to listen, but we're going to sit and we're going to hear all these ideas. And when that happens, it's funny how in many cases people sort of once they get away from the glare of some light, that they have some conversations. I'm always surprised when I get notes from from some 80-year-old white farmer in the Sandhills in Nebraska, and I get them very nice letters from people who say, we've got some differences obviously in who it is that you are and who I am, but I read how you grew up, and there's some things we had in common, and that gives me hope. That's one letter like that tells me that there's an opportunity for another one of those sticks to be in the dam somehow. So that's also an inclusion conversation.
Yeah, it's not going to these rural communities and just have a conversation about something that they already know and love. They love the Bob, they love the wilderness that's at their back door, but having the conversations about how do we make sure that everybody has the equitable access to wildness, whether it's that wilderness or just to the idea of wildness, and that idea is connected, whether it's access to time spent in the Bob or time spent in your backyard, right? And that the conversation can't be myopic and just, as I tend to get, focused on the Wilderness Act and this gift that we've been given, but to go back to the dam analogy, this dam that is feeling some strain right now, as it should, because some of those early sticks in the dam have turned to mud, and we can't rely on that as our foundation anymore. We're, as I knew would happen, we're rapidly reaching our conclusion here, and that this is a conversation that does need to continue to evolve. But at some point, we have to put a period to the sentence that is tonight's conversation. Final thoughts from you, Drew, and one practical question somebody had is, how can they get their hands on Reimagining Wildness on that piece? Where can they find that?
Oh, it's a piece that I'll try to publish it. Is what I'll try to do. This was mostly written at airports and in delay. So, but it's a piece that I want to publish. So I'll make sure that maybe it's some way that Bill and I can work at getting it published somewhere. So, but I wanted to say, Bill, you said you kept using the word gift, and I think that's a proper term. And imperfect people gave us a gift. And I think some of them were doing the best that they maybe knew how. But I think also that we have to learn how to re-gift, right? And that we pass that gift on. There's nothing wrong with that. But we just ask them, we say, here's a gift. How are we going to use this together?
Yeah.
And then we figure that out going forward. But I think one of the baselines that we do is to continue to have these conversations. And Bill, I'm so grateful to you. I realize that as sitting over your shoulder, the Bob Marshall sign, I think I probably actually said Bob a couple of times because I keep looking at Bob Marshall Wilderness right over your shoulder.
I get called Bob all the time because I'm Bill working for the Bob. That's okay.
But I won't call you Billy Bob.
Please.
But Bill, I love you, man. I love what you do. I'm so happy that you're out there doing it and carrying the banner. So thank you. And I look forward to more work together. And thanks for everybody for coming tonight.
Yeah, I love you too, Drew. And I look forward to us breaking bread again together real soon. Hopefully out here in Montana. Look forward to getting you out here. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation tonight, folks. Our next installment of the Wilderness Speaker Series will be on March 3rd, which will feature John McCarthy, who's the author of the book, Working the Wilderness, Early Leaders for Wildlands. And we look forward to that conversation 1 month from tonight. Again, Drew, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. And we look forward to this just being the start of a conversation that has been going on and will continue to go on. And hope everybody has a great night. Thank you, everybody.